Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities. Bogdan Khmelnytsky. The end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. For Ukrainians, it was the time of long and blood-shedding struggle against economic and political domination of Polish nobility. People's hatred towards occupants led to numerous peasants and Cossacks revolts led by Krzysztof Kosinski, Semen Naливайко, Taras Trasilo, Pavlo But, Dmytro Hunia, Grigory Loboda, and others. The rebels' motto was, "To die or to hang, you only live once." In 1648, Ukraine was stirred by Bogdan Khmelnytsky. The revolt began in Zaporizhzhia Sich and quickly spread across Ukraine. On December 11, 1648, the uprising shook Kiev. The rebels seized the castle with cannons and ammunition along with the city hall. After several successful battles with Poles near Zhovty Vody and Pilyavtsi, in February, 60th Army marched into Kiev on December 23, 1648. Polish nobles managed to pillage the city completely before they finally fled. They even took fragments of frescoes from the walls of Sofia Cathedral. Khmelnytsky entered the city through the Golden Gate. There were bells ringing in every church and cannons saluting. Khmelnytsky began to openly speak about Ukraine leaving Rzeczpospolita. In February 1649, he held negotiations with representatives of the Polish king, where he proclaimed, "Kiev is mine. I am its master and warlord." Successful battle near Zboriev in 1649 led to signing of a peaceful treaty which granted Khmelnytsky the domain of Chernihiv, Kiev and Podillia. But everybody understood that the war wasn't over. Poland was gathering its strength. In June 1651, Ukrainian army suffered a mighty blow at the battle near Berestechko. Capturing Chernobyl, Dymyr and Vyshgorod, the attackers came close up to Kiev. The local garrison was forced to retreat. On July 25th, the Polish-Lithuanian army of Hetman Janusz Radziwiłł stormed the city. A terrible fire broke out. The city was plundered and its inhabitants massacred. The Cossacks, who eventually had to leave Kiev in September, cried when they saw the ruined and devastated capital. There were almost no survivors. Dead bodies lay everywhere, while dogs rummaged among the ashes. Podil took most of the damage from the fire, which destroyed around 2,000 houses. Bogdan Khmelnytsky was forced to sign a burdensome treaty which restored the Polish rule almost completely. This happened on September the 18th in Bila Tserkva. During the next year, the Polish raids on Kiev continued, although none of them was successful. Khmelnytsky realized that he wasn't strong enough to defend Ukraine's independence on his own. After long hesitations, whether to join forces with Turks or Russians, the Council of Ukrainian Cities, along with Kiev, decided in favor of Moscow. On January the 8th, 1654, the Pereyaslawski Council took place. The military union, signed by the Russian Tsar, granted Ukraine the right to elect its hetman and local governors. Cossacks retained their previously owned estate and property. Hetman retained his right to foster relations with all countries except Turkey and Poland. In March 1654, after negotiations between Russian government and Cossack officers, Kiev received a charter granting it independent administration and law courts. The time of prosperity was returning to Kiev once again. The city grows bigger, with Lukyanivka and Kirillivska Street, now Frunze, being added to the plan. In 1679, the Cossacks of Hetman Ivan Samoilovich began building fortifications around Pechersk-Lavra, later known as the Old Fort. The upper city had its rampart rebuilt and reinforced. Pechersk and Podil were connected with the upper city by trenches. A new road, built in 1711, had to improve communication between districts. Its length closely corresponds to modern Hrushevskoe Street and Volodymyrsky Slope. Fortifications were also built from the side of the Dnipro and Obolon. Beginning of the 18th century saw the creation of Kievan province, and at the end of the same century, after all right bank Ukraine was annexed to Russia, Kiev gained an official status of a province center. It had become one of the biggest administrative, industrial, and cultural centers of the Russian Empire. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Inter-TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Kiev, The mother of Rus cities, the Russian Empire. In the beginning of the 18th century, the Kievan province was established. The status of a province center was granted later in the same century, after the whole of the right bank Ukraine was annexed to Russia. In the second half of the 18th century, a number of large state enterprises appear in the city. Kiev's arsenal was built during years 1750-1763 as the first factory for production and repair of artillery. It has been active since 1764. Due to singularity of its geography and location, Kiev had never been a continuous city until the 18th century. Each of its three parts, Podil, Pechersk, and the Upper City, had their own administration. The Upper City was governed by Sofia and Mikhailovsky monasteries and partly by the high command of the Russian garrison. Pechersk, where all administrative buildings moved to since the establishment of Kievan province in 1708, was under the jurisdiction of Governor-General and partly Pechersk monastery. Podil was governed by the magistrate on terms of self-governing district. In 1797, the famous contract fair was moved from Dubna to Kiev, where it gathered twice a year on Bread Trader Square in Podil. Each year, merchants and landowners came there to sign major transactions. At the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, Kiev was a city of 57 streets, 101 smaller streets, 11 squares, 8 bridges and 11 exits out of the city. During that period, Khreshchatyk becomes the main street. In 1811, a terrible fire spread over the most populated part of the city, Podil, where the two-thirds of the city's houses were located. The fire raged for 3 days. Thick clouds of smoke were seen as far as 130 kilometers away. Only 2 of Podil's streets remained undamaged, Voloska and Mezhihirska. Despite the disaster, Podil quickly rose from the ashes. In 1812, a new construction plan for Podil was approved. It refused the former radial street orientation in favor of square blocks of houses and intersecting streets. The general building plan for Kiev, designed by the architect Vikenty Beretti, was meant to unite Pechersk, Podil, and the Upper City into a single entity. As part of the project, several major streets were laid: Volodymyrska, Bibikovsky Boulevard, now Shevchenko, along with their adjoining blocks. Velika Vasilkivska Street also grew rapidly. In 1842, the construction of University building was finished. Alexandrivska Street, now Hrushevsko, was prolonged further. During 1848 to 1853, a chain bridge was erected. In the next 40 years, the number of educational facilities increased from 38 to 152, while their number of students grew from 5,460 to 22,000. The Polytechnical Institute was founded in 1898. 1862, a new factory, now known as Bolshevik, began its work. From 1870 to 1872, the city's water supply system was put into operation. The sewerage system followed in 1894. The first electrical tram in Russia and the second in Europe rumbled down the street of Kiev in 1892. Its route went along the modern Volodymyrsky slope, which connected Podil and the Upper City. The telephone lines have been operating in Kiev since 1888. The city administration during 1870s had gradually moved from Pechersk to Khreshchatyk. Here, during years 1874-1876, the building of town council was erected. The first major chain bridge across the Dnipro, and the longest one in Europe of that time, was finished in 1871. The first circus house appeared on Horodetsko Street. In the early 20th century, Kiev expands its territory. While it constituted about 64 square kilometers in 1904, after annexing Solomenka, Baty Mountain, Protasiev Yar, Shulavka, and Karavai Dachi in the first decades of the century, the territory expanded to 1,234 square kilometers. Kiev's governors constantly improved the city's good looks. By the early 20th century, Kiev was one of the most beautiful and organized cities of Europe, a pearl in the royal crown. Inter TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Inter TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the days of Kiev. Kiev, The mother of Rus cities. The Civil War. The February Revolution of 1917 in Petrograd was already on the news in Kiev by February 27th-28th. Three centers of authority are formed in the city: the Province Commissariat of the Provisional Government, the Council of Workers and Peasants' Deputies, which united Russian Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and Social Republicans, and the Central Ukrainian Council, founded by Mikhailo Hrushevsky. On June 10th, or 23rd Old Style, 1917, the Central Council issues the first manifesto declaring Ukraine's autonomy. During the October events in 1917, Kiev had become an arena of struggle between the armies of Bolsheviks, the Central Council, and the Provisional Government. On November the 7th, or 20th Old Style, 1917, the Central Council issues the third manifesto proclaiming the Ukrainian People's Republic. Early in December, the army of Central Council surrounded the Bolshevik military units and disarmed them. The Ukrainian Bolshevik leaders moved to Kharkiv and declared the establishment of the Soviet power in Ukraine. The Civil War begins. January 1918 remains in Kiev's memory forever. Early in the month, the Bolshevik armies, led by a fanatical leader, Muravyov, begin general offensive on Kiev. Rebellious workers from the arsenal plant captured several ammunition depots and the bridge across the Dnipro. Despite their furious resistance, the armies of the Central Council stormed the factory on January 21st. Many workers who stood to the last were killed in action, with 300 more executed later the same day. The 7,000 men of Muravyov were already approaching the city. The Central Council could only match them with 100 cadets, another 100 students, and a few dozen haidamaks. A small group of those youngsters attempting to cut the Bolsheviks at the Kruty station were heavily outnumbered. Almost all of the young defenders died there. Later, the bodies of 28 fallen soldiers were buried with military honors at the Askold grave in Kiev. Their heroic effort did not allow Muravyov to easily capture the city. On January 27, the Central Council manages to sign a peace treaty with countries of the Big Four: Germany, Austria and Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey. But despite this, the armies of Muravyov storm into the city. After 15,000 shellfire shots, after massive destruction and fire, the city is massacred. Muravyov was the first during the Civil War to use noxious gases prohibited by all international treaties as a bigotry weapon. Those gases helped him to seize all bridges across the Dnipro and break through defense systems of Ukrainian armies on the Dnipro slopes. On March the 1st, the city is invaded by German troops, which renew the power of the Central Council. In 1918, the Kiev region had lived through several political regimes: the one of Hetman Skoropadsky, the UPR Directory, and the German-Austrian occupants. The partisan movements of Nestor Makhno spread in Tarascha and Zvenigorodka provinces. The armies of Hetman Skoropadsky were defeated on November 18th near Motovilivka. Soon afterwards, Hetman renounced the power in favor of the Directory. In 1919, Ataman's people began Jewish pogroms in Kiev. In the summer of the same year, Kiev region was occupied by General Denikin, who brought social and cultural oppression as well as new Jewish pogroms. Eventually, Denikin was forced out of Kiev by the Soviets, although in May 1920, Kiev was invaded by the Polish army of Pilsudski and the army of UPR. For some time, the front line stabilized along Vyshhorod, Brovary and Borispil. In June 1920, the Soviet armies launched a counteroffensive, pushing the front to the north of Kiev. On June the 12th of the same year, the Red Army captured Kiev and finally renewed the power of Soviets. Inter TV channel dedicated to the celebration of the Days of Kiev.